Good evening. My name's Michael Rawson. I'm part of the team here at the Cathedral, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to welcome you here into the Gary Weston Library for Paddy's book launch. Language with Altitude just says something both about Paddy, but also about his passion for both the spoken word and the written word, words which transform, words which inspire. Paddy has been writing professionally for over 40 years, and his publications include Music and Musicians and the Financial Times. He has a huge experience of teaching creative writing and analytical thinking, as well as writing skills. I know a lot actually, about how much this evening means to Paddy. But it also means a huge amount to Southwark Cathedral. Paddy is a really important member, a passionate member of our cathedral community, and so we're really proud to be able to support you this evening.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. On to the interview. I said something a little about your passion for words, for language. In your foreword in the book, you talk about inspirational language is an endangered species.
Yes.
Would you like to unpack
I certainly would. It occurs to me that when I was a young man, people used to talk to one another. Conversation was everywhere. Everything was local. You could walk into your local shop or bank and have a conversation with somebody who knew you. And now, of course, all the shutters have come down. Corporations have taken over the interface. How many of you have walked along the street today and almost bumped into somebody whose world has been reduced to a little screen 3 inches square and is not aware of what's going on around or the people around? It worries me deeply that we are being encouraged to communicate through corporations who have absolutely no care for who we are, but only for making money out of us. Corporate speak has now been reduced to the level of unidentified item in bagging area. And we are slowly acceding to this by submitting to the relentless pressure to get the meaning out of language so that we can simply serve the needs of the corporates. So my aim is to restore conversation to where it used to be, because conversation is the most creative force imaginable.
I've got a real love of seascapes, and so I was delighted to see the cover of the book and the fact that sea and sky appear throughout the book. Could you tell us why you landed on that particular image?
I can indeed, and here it is for anyone who's not seen it. This is Aldborough, one morning at about 6 o'clock, sun coming up, although we don't see the sun in this photograph. This is County Donegal, the sky. Windswept afternoon about 45 years ago. And the whole idea of this is that if you think of every sunspot as being a piece of information, language with altitude takes it up, makes creative leaps, and brings out new ideas, new meanings, often new departures from those words. That's the whole concept behind this book. Of course, you hear the phrase blue sky thinking. I didn't coin that phrase, but it's very apt for my idea of language with altitude.
I think this evening is a real discovery for us all, and getting into Paddy's mind about what language is about and celebrating language. One of the words that I haven't come across before is prose verse, which you talk about on the back of the book and throughout the book.
Yes.
Could you explain a little bit about what prose verse is?
It sounds like prose. You should not know that you're actually reading verse, but there are very strict rhythms and little hidden rhymes. Now, I'm going to get my lovely actors to explain, and I'm so grateful to them for giving up their evening to be here. You've all got the little card, I hope, with biographies on them. If not, you can certainly pick one up at the end. Maurice, Sophie, Mike, and Carol, please tell us about prose verse.
Prose verse sounds like normal speech.
It's different though. In prose verse,
Each sound fits the rhythmic pattern. There
are hidden rhymes. We're unaware
of all these inner workings.
when we're listening. That's because
the sentences express their meaning
clearly. We imagine that we're here
hearing ordinary prose. We
Concentrate on what's being said, not on...
on the technicalities, whereas
as pure verse, the sort we're used to,
has a different emphasis such that
We're more aware of rhythmic patterns.
in a limerick, for instance, we know
by the pauses that break up the flow,
there'll be certain times when we're going to hear rhymes.
And we'll know when it's finished.
like so.
prose verse is altogether less
Predictable and more
Expressive than pure verse. It is more
pleasing to the ear than prose, and
easier to commit to memory.
with its gentle rhymes and steady
rhythms. Prose verse's greatest strength lies
in the fascinating disciplines
that it imposes on the writer.
Writing good prose verse
is quite a challenge. Every word must
be subjected to close scrutiny
of meaning, sound, accentuation,
rhythm, context. The
formation of prose verse is like a
love affair with English. The
discovery of new words, meanings,
and new sounds enriches understanding
of the language. The prose verse,
though, is not exclusively for
poets. There's something in prose verse technique
for everyone who needs to
speak or write persuasively. For those
who work with rhythmic speech,
composers, actors, singers, those who
reach out to the public with their
speech, who must use pithy, eloquent,
amusing, memorable
sentences, presenters, business
leaders, politicians, those who
need good English for their first or
second language, who must learn correct
pronunciation and develop
their awareness of the
elements of style and usage.
Writers of all sorts who wish to
heighten their expressive capabilities
or their creative
skills, and poets who have never
fully fathomed the incredible
potential of the simple art
of writing verse. So, let's get started.
This book has been a real labour of love for you. Started around 25 years ago, the whole project.
Yes.
So it's very different from your original.
It is.
But would you tell us something about the history of it?
Yes, it began in 1997. My children, I have 3 sons, of whom 2 are here. They're at the back, Will and Ed. And, oh, look at that. Oh, a round of applause for being sons. While they were at school, I used to go and do voluntary teaching, only of the weird sort, nothing to do with the curriculum, origami, music appreciation. And one year, it was 97, I hit on the idea of starting a verse prize in the school, so that every child who submitted a verse would receive a copy of her or his verse, beautifully printed on a certificate, with a wonderfully encouraging personal comment at the bottom, and a little book about writing verse. I have a copy of it here. It's called The Younger Person's Guide to Verse, and this is early days word processing, as you can see, all the stuff that really now looks so unsophisticated. Each child received one of these. I noticed the teachers started using them, so that really was very pleasing. And for the second year of the competition, I wrote another, and another, and another, and we ended up with 7 books. And the last one, which is here, is the only one to have been incorporated virtually unchanged in the rewrite that is called Language with Altitude. So you'll find, if you get the book, that it is in 8 little chunks, each one running to 32 pages, all written in prose verse, which may sound like an affectation, but it is actually a very practical writing tool, not only because of its impact on the listener when spoken aloud, but also because of its impact on the writer. It slows you down. You've got to find le mot juste every time, otherwise you can't go on. And that slowing down fires creativity further. If you've never tried writing prose verse, I cannot recommend it highly enough. So I had to rewrite the whole series because by the end, some of this stuff looked absolutely facile. I was looking at the one today called Stirring Words, which is one of the titles that is carried forward. But when I opened the book for the first time in years, I couldn't recognize a word of it. And it's not nearly as grown up and informative as the one that's in the book. And in the process of the rewriting, I discovered the creative process, which is probably the most exciting thing of the whole thing.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that creative
I
process?
do. Further.
Feeding you the lines.
The elements of the creative process are nothing new. They were defined by Aristotle. He describes two forms of reasoning, one of which is called inductive reasoning, or induction, or inductive thinking. The other is deductive. Now, we're all familiar with the deductive, so I'll start there. This image quite helps again. You imagine a funnel of information starting with very broad information and narrowing down to a single deductive point. In a game where we start with a series of rooms and people and weapons, and we reach the conclusion that the murder was committed in the library by the dean using a candlestick. And that's deductive reasoning. Inductive is so much more exciting and powerful, and we do it all the time, by the way. There's nothing grand about this. You take a set of observations and you simply say the first thing that came into your head. That's why I said conversation is creative. Conversation is inductive. You don't know where it's going. You can have any number of different conclusions. They may all be wrong, but they're all exciting. My favourite example of induction is the first words that Mr. Sherlock Holmes says to Dr. Watson. I see you have been to Afghanistan. And what he's done is taken a series of observations about Watson and leapt to this idea. He hasn't reasoned it out in the way that he does later in the deductive process. He's just created something and tried it out. Now, what I've done that Aristotle didn't do is to connect the two together. Our thought process, which is natural, we all do it 1,000 times a day without even thinking about it. We think inductively. We grab a few ideas, we take one or two that look interesting, bring them down, choose, refine, go back up again into the higher sphere. And that symbiosis describes thought and creativity. That's the creative process. Now, am I going to cue my actors? Yes, I am. Because they're going to read a chapter from the book called Creative Writing, I think it is. Actors, please.
Inductive and deductive reasoning are inextricably connected. Without the free association of ideas, there would be no progress, no new thinking, no new writing. Without narrowing our field of thought and bringing it towards a thought-provoking end, our minds would be a mass of broken, unconnected, unintelligible loose ends, meaningless and glib. Creative writing in this sense is a misnomer. The inconsequential nature of creative thinking sees to that. Inductive reasoning must have its day, of course, but it's no use until it's endorsed by critical evaluation and meaningful interpretation. Let me show you how it works in practice by embarking on some actual creative writing. I'll try some inductive thinking, and with any luck, I'll hit on something useful.
There's a sign that says, "To let."
Another fine spring day. Amanda takes her children to the park.
I want my daddy.
Still no message. What's become of him?
The first of these were random images. The sign, the outing to the park. The image of the children was the spark for the induction to begin. The sign is on their house. They're in the throes of moving house. How old are the children? There's an infant holding back her tears. She wants her daddy. That's it. That's why she's so sad. He's obviously left home recently. Amanda's wondering why he's failed to get in touch. An accident, perhaps? Maybe he meant to disappear. The train of thought takes longer to explain than it took to occur. Inductive thinking happens in the blinking of an eye. That's not surprising if you only realise how used we are to making sense of information that's immediately complex. When our senses fill with sights, sounds, smells, all unfamiliar, we interpret them at lightning speed. So it's quite an easy matter to interpret just a few words. They're the tiny sketch that we, by instinct, stretch across the panoramic canvas of the imagination, upon which our memory paints a richly textured, colourful invention, living, breathing, three-dimensional. All this unbidden, and perhaps without our even knowing that we're tapping onto what may prove to be a truly great idea. I call this process serial induction. Ideas are hurled like stucco onto an empty wall without regard to how intelligent they are. Coming back to poor Amanda, we're still not sure what happened to her man. Was there an accident? Or did he plan to go? Or was it both these things or something else? The question brings the inductive thinking to a halt, while we deduce which path is best and cite the reasons for our choice. In a creative setting as this, we may let imagination be our guide, some more induction, and then decide.
Paul lies unconscious in intensive care. For 2 whole days, Amanda's unaware of where he's got to. Their young daughter takes it badly and falls ill. The phone's cut off. They couldn't pay the bill.
Or I might focus on the planned abandonment.
As he speeds towards the ferry, Roger feels a terrible pang of remorse. Perhaps he should have said where he was going, but he couldn't bring himself. She deserved no better, but the twins. Too bad. He had to get away.
I call this parallel induction, telling different stories from the same point to explore alternative ideas creatively. Though these ideas emanate from a single source, they're quite distinct. They might conceivably be linked together, or I might reject one. I might make some more, select a few that suit my style, and then connect them with the help of more induction into a coherent story. The deductive element is fairly slight so far. It's merely choosing which inductive train of thought to use. But if we punctuate the thought process by posing, searching fundamental questions such as, where is all this leading? Or what am I trying to say? By thinking forward to the outcome, we provide a focal point towards which we may guide our thoughts. It seems to me that those parallel scenarios suggest a theme of reconciliation with which both ideas are connected.
Andrew, disillusioned, runs away from wife and family, but doesn't say where or why he's going. Amanda, searching for him, finds him lying half dead in the wreckage of his car and saves his life. They realise how fortunate they are to have each other.
Suddenly, I've got an interesting plot in outline. If it seems familiar, it's because the theme's as old as humankind. That's not to say I won't find new angles, though, for what I must do next is to flesh out my plot inductively, and, since I'm writing fiction, my field of thought is unrestricted. If my imagination can conceive it, and my readers will believe in it, it will be valid. I must simply work out all the reasons why the reconciliation happens and explain the situation step by step. Alternatively, I might merely give some tantalising clues so that my readers have to use their own imagination to explain my meaning. The deductive train of thought is the defining moment. I can now design my plot with confidence. I may include my first ideas or throw them all away, as long as I am mindful of the need to find inductive storylines that fit my purpose and produce my written text accordingly.
Amanda. It was a long wait. She stayed by the bed where he lay silent in a coma. She would not go home, she told herself, until she knew not what. The stillness was unbearable. Where did he go? Why did he not say where? The lid of one eye flickered open, then the other. Hope was born again. He scanned the room. She placed her hand on his and smiled. Her eyes met his. She recognised that look of fear and hatred, and she knew too late that all the promises he made were lies and that she was betrayed.
There was a really beautiful phrase in that, the panoramic canvas of the imagination.
Yes, I love that phrase. I'm sure many of you are aware of Waterloo Bridge, and at the south end of it there's this vast cylindrical building which is the 3D cinema. When the children were small and it first opened, we used to go in there. And the screen fills the entire field of vision, top, right, left. And of course you have these funny Polaroid glasses that put everything into 3D. It's terrifying. Closest I've ever come to virtual reality. That for me is the panoramic canvas of the imagination. But we all have it in our minds, and it's the thing known as the mind's eye. When someone throws a piece of information at us, we immediately start to build a picture in the eye of the mind. Well, I can only speak for myself, but I know that others share this experience. And I hope to demonstrate to you in a few minutes that you too share the experience.
So is that a little bit like dreams then?
I suppose it is a bit like dreaming, because if you think we shut off all our senses, and yet we still have these images, tangible, real, so real, that it can wake you up and cause you to cry out. That's the mind's eye in action. It's memories that come up there, and it all happens so rapidly that we don't know where they're coming from. But what we're doing is building up a picture based on incomplete information. As new information comes in, our picture changes. The big problem comes with the fact that so many words have so many different meanings. What we have to do then is to rebuild that picture. We may start with something that's quite wrong, sweep it away, and gradually build up and up. From the book, there is a chapter called Ambiguity, which we're about to explore. In the first instance, I want them to give us some definitions which are taken from the Oxford English Dictionary. My shorter Oxford Dictionary is my desert island book, by the way. I want them to list some definitions of the word not, K-N-O-T. Please, actors.
Nautical miles per hour.
An obligation.
A tangle in a rope.
A hill.
A complex problem.
An Arctic breeding sandpiper.
A condition.
A binding.
A carved knob.
A growth in human tissue.
And more besides.
This is the experiment now. You're all taking part in this silently. I'm going to invite Maurice to read us a sentence based on the word not. And I want you all, and especially you, Michael, because I'm going to ask you to think about what this means to you and try to describe to me afterwards, Michael, the image that forms in your mind's eye as you hear this story. Maurice, please.
There it was, the knot, the very knot itself that had been staring at him all these months.
Michael, what does that do for you?
It feels like a very physical presence. One of the definitions was of a carving.
Right.
And for me, probably because I work in this place, but, that sort of image, a very material image.
Right. And yours is a carving in essence.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, mine is quite different. Mine is an ornithologist in a hide in the Arctic Circle, peering at an Arctic breeding sandpiper, which appears to stare firmly back at him through the binoculars. And I dare say that all of you have different images. What's happening here is what I call subtext. Subtext is the bit that you bring out of your memory to form images such as Michael's carving. That becomes part of a picture that you are developing. As we go on, and we will come back to Maurice, who'll give us more information, we're building up and changing that picture. It's not a conventional definition of subtext because A lot of people, when they use the word subtext, mean the James Joyce Ulysses thing, the Homeric references, or the T.S. Eliot with the endless references in every line, which is directly and deliberately connected to something. That is subtext, but my subtext, the one that I value most, is the one that I create when I'm listening. And the reason I value it so much is that the images that form in my mind's eye fire my imagination towards new ideas. So, shall we proceed and hear this chapter, or most of it, on ambiguity?
There it was, the knot, the very knot itself, that had been staring at him all these months.
We can't say what that means with any certainty. Our instinct is to guess. We search for knots within our memory, and if there's time for a full investigation, we will find associations for each of the different sorts of knot that come to mind. This non-specific introduction to the knot imposes almost no constraints. It might bear any one of those interpretations, obvious or quite obscure. And so, its power to evoke is made the greater by broadening its scope for ambiguity. Whilst that scope emanates primarily from focused dictionary definitions, it need not end there. Our minds evoke associatively, flitting freely from idea to idea and collecting memories along the way. If we take time to stop and think, our minds may seize on unforeseen associations by inductive reasoning. When we read, our imaginations range less freely insofar as we are being directed by the text we see, and yet we are associative. The unexpected happens anyway, particularly when the writer brings symbolic meanings into play. Metaphors are a singularly powerful associative tool. It serves as symbols for others that aren't stated in the text. The prehistoric images carved on cave walls suggest that metaphors as old as thought itself. The scenes of life expressed in them are longer stories told through symbols. Crude lines etched in stone evoke remembered images in our mind's eye. A single sketch becomes a living, present, detailed picture. This example illustrates symbolic thinking fairly clearly. Literally speaking, metaphor means upward bearing, carrying beyond. A metaphor invites us to interpret words beyond the usual set of meanings, making us construe new, plausible alternatives. The thought process is fundamentally inductive, although there's a further, salient, deductive aspect. This is best explained through example. Let's consider that word not again. It has its origins in Dutch, High Middle German, and Old English. The essential themes are rope and intertwining, and the OED shows how most other meanings opened up around the central principle. The knot of hard, contracted rope in Middle English lent its name to a compact lump of human tissue, and, at more or less the same time, to a complication in a story. The nautical knot, too, is taken from a length of rope with evenly positioned knots. The speed of any vessel travelling at sea could be precisely gauged by feeding out the rope and taking note of the rate of knots. This sense of knots as lumps or marks that serve as breakpoints in a line or plot continues to develop to this day through node, directly from the Latin nodus, knot, by way of Middle English, tumour. Mathematically speaking, node means junction, intersection. Scientists have taken up this theme and hung new meanings on it, often highly specialised. Such etymology is evidence of the inductive power of language, letting words evolve through free association of ideas. There's a metaphorical dimension too. All these knots were derived by simple logical extension from the knotted rope. The fundamental rope knot may stand as a metaphor for any one of them. Well, most of them, anyway. I know I can open up some of these possibilities in readers' minds with the appropriate symbolic keys.
Now, we haven't come quite to the end of that chapter, but Michael, you wanted to say.
Yeah. One of the things that we just heard is that metaphor is upward bearing, carrying beyond.
Have you spotted the connection?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the whole idea of altitude,
Yes.
that gorgeous picture,
Yes.
the funnel. Do you want to say
Yeah,
something a
these are
little bit more?
all very closely interrelated. And for me, the core of all this is metaphor. I want to encourage you all in the use of metaphor. I should say, first of all, that as Sophie was explaining so beautifully, the concept of metaphor is nothing new either, because our lives are constructed entirely out of symbols. If I say the word ball, that is not a ball, it's a symbol for the word ball, and yet we can all see a ball. If I say B-A-L-L, that's a symbol for ball, and so on. And symbols are endless. We never get to the real thing. Even if science is to be believed, I see you, but I'm not seeing you, I'm seeing light reflected from your face, which symbolizes you. Now, in order to get my head around this, I will say that my favourite categories of metaphor are those where I use metaphor to try to understand an abstract concept. Here's the one I've been thinking of recently. Time is a motorway. I am seated in a vehicle with no front windscreen. My only view of the motorway is in the rear view mirror. I look out at the side and I see things flashing by, but I've no idea where they are going or I am going. I find that metaphor interesting because it draws out some similarities between the two concepts of the motorway and time. Obviously, the forward movement, the speed. But the two are not the same because they are inherently different. Time is not a motorway. And this has the benefit of raising very awkward but important questions, such as, if I am on this motorway of time, what about these people who are in the background? Some of them speeding past me, some falling away. Is time the same for all of us? Who's driving the car? And it's not just for me as the person who's thinking that through, it's also for you. As you are trying to interpret those metaphors in your own way, you are forced into open questioning, inductive reasoning, so that you begin to explore the topic. If it really excites you, it can become a research study in itself.
So far tonight, Paddy, we've heard about creative writing. What about if I'm a journalist or a business writer or even a preacher? How is your book going to help us?
Thank you, Michael. I almost stumbled into the next thing I was going to say. The clue is in the title of the book. It's not about creative writing, it is about language. But in order to write a book, you need to write creatively. So, most of my writing experience has been in very mundane areas of business writing and analytical writing. And I've tried in my writing, especially I spent 10 years writing for lawyers, I tried to take them off the tracks of language and push them into whole new ways of looking at their own practices. I would commend the ideas in this book to anybody who has got an interest in language, because we need to have them in order to give energy to our own thought processes. Does that answer your question?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Right. And I think we've still got to come to the end of the chapter on ambiguity, which we're going to do now. Here, I want you to focus on the words. Forget the creative writing angle, although Maurice is going to give us a tiny bit of it, and just listen to what the words are doing for us and see if they move you in the same way as they move me. Sophie Morris.
Back to my previous example.
There it was, the knot. The very knot itself that had been staring at him all these months. So small a dot upon the blood-stained chart of his forlorn adventure, yet so raw, so swollen, as if all his misery were pent up in the unsettled tangle of its coils.
Consider what I've done here. This is no mere knot. This is emotion, boiling up to an explosive climax. I've put all the emphasis upon the metaphor. Note in particular the visceral words: blood-stained, swollen, raw. My principal concern is to convey a physical sensation of discomfort, which I do by playing up to your imagination. This knot is a tumour of distressed anxiety, and yet it's more than that. There's lots of room for doubt. The central metaphor holds out the possibility that this knot is an intellectual problem too, so grievous as to have the most profound effect upon our hero. Lastly, since I want to make you think associative thoughts, I add some incidental elements that link up with the other knot or two. The tangled cords suggest a rope, and there's the image of the dot upon a chart. I'm hoping that a few of my readers may connect with the nodes as knots, though that might be too indirect for most. Such minor details do not matter greatly. What's important is the powerful, evocative potential of the metaphorical construction. By unlocking memories across a spectrum of symbolic meanings, we create an image rich with possibilities of meanings and use deductive thinking to identify precisely what the writer meant.
Thank you, Sophie, very much. Michael, just before we go on, there was something I suddenly remembered. In the newspaper this morning, there was an article by the Astronomer Royal, the Scottish Astronomer Royal, and she was saying, people think science is not creative, but science is, in fact, one of the most creative fields imaginable. Scientists don't just do the deduction. They create hypotheses about the way things might work, and then they gather data in order to try and test those hypotheses. They then have to deduce, they'll amend the theory and move up. And scientists use string theory, atomic theory. You'll never hear them being absolutely categorical about what they think they believe.
Can we move from science to emotion? So the connection between language and emotion. Could you tell us a little bit about how you've written about that?
Well, this was the other big thing about the rewrite, and what it gave me was the connection between language and emotion, which is very deep-seated. I observe that our minds work by the making and breaking of patterns. These are formed in early childhood. In adult life, we see them all the time, the times of day, the seasons, cycles, patterns. When something goes wrong, such as a desperately hot summer, you think, hey, my pattern's no longer working. These things begin preschool. The game of peekaboo is all about patterns. Mother appears from behind a thing, she disappears and comes back from a different angle, baby laughs. This is all about observing behavior and working out how things are going to happen in the future based on how they've happened in the past. Because those patterns are fundamentally emotional, because babies don't have any spoken language, they have to communicate through grunts and cries, only gradually building up the language, so that when the words come, they are fundamentally rooted in the child's emotional makeup. There are many sections in Language with Altitude which deal with this. Emotion in the sense of comedy. Comedy is built on the idea that we have a makeup of a pattern and then a humorous breaking of it. Music speaks to the emotions which are illiterate. Music is the universal language because it requires no spoken language. and so on and so on. And finally, I want to take us into the subject of memorability, because it's on my list of things that language with altitude is, and we have hardly talked about it yet. The whole idea of prose verse is that it may not be memorable, but it has the capacity to be memorable, properly used. And we're going to have an excerpt from the chapter on rhetoric. And it was only when I wrote this book that I began to understand the purpose of rhetoric. I've spelled out 4 purposes in the book. We're going to hear an excerpt from rhetoric now, which talks about 2 of them. One is rhetoric as a means of emphasizing points that you really want people to remember. And the other is about rhetoric as a tool for memorability itself. Who's going to lead us? Mike, thank you.
Emphasis. A speech may have more impact if the words are spoken out of sequence. The subliminal effect of putting strong or otherwise important words first is to prolong short-term persistence. They live shorter in the mind's eye if they're spoken later in the sentence and then quickly brushed off by new words with greater impact or a new idea. This trick works in reverse as well. If you delay a chosen keyword till the end and build your text up to the payoff, you encourage listeners to extend their subtext. The build-up helps to emphasize your point, enhancing its appeal to memory.
Rhetorical devices for emphasizing points. Commeratio.
Reiterating a point using different words.
Repeat your theme to strengthen its impression. Rephrase it 3 or 4 times in succession. Say it again. This helps to keep it fresh in the mind's eye.
Hysteron proteron.
Moving the last word to be the first.
Reasoning, inductive and deductive, leads to understanding.
Climax.
Building up ideas towards a payoff.
The tree of fruitful thought is rooted in self-will, self-knowledge and self-discipline.
Hyperbaton.
Reversing the usual order of the words.
Self-doubt cast out.
Controlled repetition. Prose verse, with its dancing rhythmic repetitions and seductive sound plays, bears the mark of rhetoric. Whilst the unbending structural constraints of prose verse are too fettersome for many writers, they, like the above devices, have their part to play in the persuader's art. Precisely calculated plays on sound are grist to the persuasive phrases radio listeners know as sound bites.
Rhetorical devices for impact and memorability. Chiasmus.
A pattern of words consisting of 2 halves, equally balanced, but with the parts reversed in the second half.
Be brief and apposite. Pit pithy with thy wit.
Isocolon.
Succeeding phrases of similar structure and length.
The highest heights of creativity spring from the deepest depths of memory.
Polyptoton.
Words with the same root repeated with different endings.
A catastrophic plot 'twould be that plotted no catastrophe.
Tricolon.
3 members linked by assonance or other similarity.
Pity the self-sensing solipsist, unseen, unheard, unloved soliloquist.
Rhetoric, like prose verse, uses patterns to effect a quickening of the heart that serves to gratify the senses and support the call to arms. Its patterns are potentially more complex, as my small selection clearly shows, but the essential point remains. Persuaders can't depend exclusively on intellectual arguments. They must extend the reach of their emotional effect.
Paddy, you've said that the book is for anybody who has a passion and a love for language. But do you actually have a target audience that you're looking for?
When writing this book, I've discovered so many things that I wished I'd learned at school. And my dream for this book is that becomes required reading for English A-level students, for humanities students in universities, if there are any left after the current round of things, and really for every single person who needs to use words. I believe that, not necessarily my book, but techniques such as those that we've begun to outline tonight are crucial if we are to maintain the species of inspirational language. Everybody that I know here has got some interest in words. I know lots of writers, and yet I don't know many writers who go as deep down, beneath the surface of those little words. We're looking at the elements, syllables, the way they're constructed, the emotional connection between sound and language, and so on. We need to go down to those depths in order to spring up to the heights. I would like to be the writer's writer. I'd like to be the old fart that people come to when they want to talk about writing. I think that's my list.
That's quite a list. Paddy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and sharing so much of you in this book this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, the life of the cathedral and the church which was first established here in the 7th century was established here because of the river crossing where London Bridge is. And over the centuries, the life of the cathedral, the priory, the parish church, and the London Bridge have been totally intertwined, and you can see that in our stained glass window above here. So I think it'd be wonderful if we could end with the poem London Bridge.
Right, we have a poem in the book which is about that. I'll explain that in a moment, but first, I'm the one with lots of thanks to make, and I'll do those now. Michael and all your cathedral colleagues who have made this possible, and our lovely team of helpers who are mostly there at the back. Odette has vanished for the moment, and Jill and Ed, who have done the stewarding for us, Will, who's doing the photographs, Grant, who's doing the books, who will be delighted to see you later. And before I come to our dear actors, there is somebody else in the room who is the love of my life, who is Barbara, who's sitting down there. We are rarely seen together, so 100 points in your I Spy book for seeing her here tonight. And the point about this is that none of this would have happened without Barbara. We, although we're not seen together, are very much together, and we had our 40th wedding anniversary 2 days ago. So, and last but not least, these lovely people who have come here: Maurice Thorogood, Sophie Morris-Sheppard, I've got them stuck on the Maurices there, Michael Duran, and Carolyn Pertwee. On your feet, please. And before they read, I talked about sunspots being little globules of information that don't really excite the mind. This poem is language with altitude for a phrase that's something like: people stream into London Bridge Station in the morning and walk over the river to their work. Please.
London Bridge.
From pathways arterial,
Early each ferial day,
Managerial types
Esoterical specialists.
clerical staff,
and professionals
join the processional matinal ritual
Who take their habitual stroll.
to their places of work,
with briefcases
of matters contractual,
Documents factual.
looks on their faces,
of mischief,
prosperity,
Candor.
temerity,
some intellectual,
some ineffectual,
Minds automatically wandering.
erratically,
gardening,
annuities,
Taught.
promiscuity,
broking,
astrology,
Client psychology.
arriving thousands,
sitting at their screens.
become the city's wonderful machine.
Thank you.
Now's your chance to ask any questions of Paddy.
Julia Haythorne. I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on ChatGPT?
We've talked about this idea of inductive reasoning, where we just take observations and grab things out of the air. Computers can't do that. Machines do not have emotion. Emotion is the core of language. Machines do not really communicate. They simply wallow around in areas of data. If you think about the most famous AI, the chess engine, that's the computer that plans chess moves. What it does is to store an entire compendium of millions of moves, rattles through them at enormous speed and comes up with the best one. Human players don't do that. They will have some ideas based on experience. They will leap towards something and put it into place. As long as computers can't do that, we are safe. However, we are not safe because AI is in the hands of people who want to make money. And therefore, the minds that they are giving to these machines are money-making minds. They're intended to manipulate our thinking so that we think we depend on them and buy more beans.
Paddy, thank you so much on behalf of all of us. You've been...
What was the first line?